October 28, 2022. Breathitt County, deep in the Appalachian heartland of Kentucky. The night is cold, and the air carries the scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke, a familiar perfume in these hills. But tonight, another smell hangs heavy, something subtly sour and unsettling, like old decay. The crunch of tires on a loose gravel road is the first sound to break the chorus of crickets, followed by the solid thud of a car door. We see the worn leather boots of Sheriff's Deputy Ben Carter as they meet the forest floor. He's a young man, but his face is etched with the seriousness of his duty. The powerful headlights of his Ford Explorer patrol unit slice through a thick twilight fog, pinning a dilapidated cabin in their beams. It's a relic, barely standing, with a single, weak yellow light flickering from a grimy window like a dying star. Deputy Carter's hand instinctively rests on the butt of his Glock 22, a familiar comfort in the unnerving quiet of Troublesome Creek. He had been sent out on a wellness check, prompted by a vague but concerned call from a census worker who couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong at the old Whitaker place. He approaches the cabin, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy earth. The porch groans under his weight. He raises his fist and knocks firmly on the weathered plank door. The only answer is the whisper of the wind through the pines. He knocks again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the stillness. Sheriff's Department, performing a wellness check for the Whitaker family. A long pause follows, pregnant with tension. Then, from inside, a faint but distinct sound. The heavy scrape of furniture being dragged slowly, deliberately, across a wooden floor. The door, bound by rust and rot, groans open just a few inches. A sliver of darkness is all Carter can see, the interior of the cabin swallowing the light from his flashlight. The acrid smell intensifies, catching in the back of his throat. He leans in slightly, trying to get a better look, when a figure shuffles in the shadows. For a split second, his light catches it, the small, pale face of a child, no older than 10. But the face is wrong. It's covered, obscured by a crude, tightly fitted mask made of what looks like stitched-together leather, with dark, empty holes for eyes. The image burns into Carter's mind, unnatural, terrifying. Before he can process the sight or utter a word, an old man's face, gaunt and fierce, appears in the crack. "You ain't welcome here," he snarls, and the door slams shut with a deafening finality. What in God's name had he just witnessed? Stumbling back from the rotting porch, Deputy Carter fumbled for the handle of his patrol unit, the image of the leather mask seared into his retinas. The slam of the cabin door echoed in the unnerving silence of the hollow, a definitive and hostile rejection. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of vinyl and stale coffee a stark contrast to the cloying odor of decay that still clung to his uniform. He couldn't just leave. What he had seen wasn't just a case of an eccentric family wanting to be left alone. It was a profound and terrifying wrongness. The child's face, or the lack of it, was probable cause for something, but he knew the law in these parts was a tangled mess of property rights and a deep-seated, leave us be, mentality. Forcing entry without a warrant was a career-ending move, and getting one based on a fleeting glimpse of a strange mask and a grumpy old man would be a tough sell to any judge in the county. He keyed his radio, his voice steadier than he felt. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 15. I've made contact at the Whitaker residence. Situation is complicated. I need to speak with Sheriff Brody directly." The radio crackled back to life, the dispatcher's voice a calm island in Carter's sea of unease. 10-4, 3 Adam 15. Stand by. A few moments of static-filled silence passed, each second stretching into a minute. Carter stared at the cabin, its single yellow light now looking less like a dying star and more like a malevolent eye. Finally, a new voice, deeper and weathered by years of dealing with the county's troubles, came through. "Ben, what have you got?" It was Sheriff Brody. Carter took a deep breath, trying to organize the chaotic images in his head into a coherent report. "Sheriff, the wellness check, it's not good. The place is a wreck." An old man, probably in his 70s, answered the door. Hostile, but before he slammed it, I saw a kid. A boy, maybe 10 years old. Sir, he was wearing a mask. Not a toy. It looked like it was made of old leather, stitched together, covering his whole face. And the smell, God, the smell. It's like something's been rotting in there for years. The line was quiet for a moment, and Carter could picture Brody running a hand over his tired face. "A mask, you say?" "Ben, You sure it wasn't just some Halloween getup? Kids in these hills play strange games. Brody's skepticism was exactly what Carter had feared, the voice of pragmatic caution that often allowed darkness to fester in forgotten places. No, sir, Carter insisted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. This wasn't a game. The way he looked, it was fear. The old man, he called himself a Whitaker, said I wasn't welcome. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was enough. This goes beyond a simple wellness check. That child is in danger. He knew how it sounded. Thin, speculative, but the visceral certainty of what he'd witnessed was undeniable. He was asking his superior to poke a hornet's nest, to challenge a family's right to privacy on the word of a deputy and an anonymous census worker. In Breathitt County, that was tantamount to declaring a small-scale war. It was a legal and cultural minefield, pitting the state's responsibility against a citizen's constitutional right to be left alone, no matter how strangely they lived. Sheriff Brody let out a long, weary sigh that crackled over the radio. All right, son, I hear you, but a judge won't grant us a warrant based on a bad smell and a weird mask. We need more. You get back to the station. I want a full written report, every single detail you can remember. The exact words the old man used, the look of the mask, the condition of the property, everything. In the meantime, I'm going to see if I can track down that census worker who made the initial call. If we can get a sworn statement from them, something more concrete than a vague feeling, we might have a shot. We're not going in half-cocked and we're not dropping it, either. But we're going to do this by the book, slow and steady. We have to be airtight, or we risk losing those kids in the system forever. Carter acknowledged the order, a cold knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. For now, all he could do was drive away, leaving the masked child in the suffocating darkness of that cabin, swallowed by the very laws he was sworn to uphold. Back at the Breathitt County Sheriff's Office, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile indifference that felt a world away from the oppressive darkness of Troublesome Creek. Deputy Carter's written report, filed as per Sheriff Brody's instructions, was a masterclass in professional restraint, yet the horror bled through the clinical language. It described the acrid odor of decay, the hostile glare of the old man, and the haunting, 30-second glimpse of the masked child. True to his word, Sheriff Brody had spent the next 12 hours working the phones, his voice a low, persistent growl of authority. He tracked down the census worker, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who agreed to come in and give a formal statement. Her testimony, combined with Carter's, painted a grim picture of extreme isolation and potential neglect, enough to finally convince a circuit court judge of the urgent need for intervention. The gears of the state began to turn, and the case was escalated, pulling in the resources of the Kentucky State Police and the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. A plan was being formed, one that would bring the full weight of the law down on that forgotten cabin. Sarah Jenkins sat across from Sheriff Brody, her hands clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee, her face pale. She was a contract worker for the U.S. Census Bureau, accustomed to guarded welcomes and barking dogs, but the Whitaker place had been different. It wasn't just that they didn't want to be counted, she explained, her voice trembling slightly. It was the smell. I've been in hoarder houses, places where animals have passed, this was worse. It was a human smell. She recounted knocking on the door and hearing a man's voice from within, yelling at her to leave. She never saw a face, but through a grimy window pane, she saw a flicker of movement, a small shape darting into the shadows. She couldn't be sure it was a child, but her gut told her so. Her sworn affidavit, detailing the refusal to answer the door, the palpable odor of human waste and rot, and the potential presence of uncounted, unseen individuals, was the final piece of the puzzle. It gave the authorities the probable cause they needed. It was no longer a deputy's hunch, it was a corroborated report of extreme endangerment. The pre-dawn briefing was tense. Gathered in the small conference room were Sheriff Brody, Deputy Carter, 2 hardened troopers from the Kentucky State Police, and a senior social worker from the CHFS named Maria Flores. On the table lay a hastily printed satellite image of the Whitaker property and the freshly signed search warrant. The document, filed under KSP Incident Report number 20220845, authorized entry to search for and assess the welfare of any minors on the premises. Jedediah Whitaker, Brody said, tapping a finger on a sparse public record file. No driver's license, no social security activity since the 70s, pays property taxes in cash once a year. He's a ghost. The state trooper in charge laid out the plan. A soft approach first, then a forced entry if necessary. Maria Flores stressed the importance of minimizing trauma to the children, who were likely completely unaccustomed to outsiders. Everyone in the room understood the risks. They were not just serving a warrant, they were piercing a bubble that had been sealed for generations, and they had no idea what they would find on the other side. The convoy of 2 patrol cars and an unmarked CHFS vehicle moved slowly down the gravel road as the sun began to crest the Appalachian ridges, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. They parked 100 yards from the cabin, the silence of the morning broken only by the crunch of their boots on the cold ground. The smell hit them long before they reached the porch, a thick, gag-inducing wave of filth that confirmed Sarah Jenkins's worst descriptions. The KSP trooper knocked, his voice booming. "State Police, we have a warrant to enter the premises." The only answer was the same defiant silence Carter had experienced. After a second, louder command went unheeded. The trooper nodded. A battering ram, a jarringly modern tool in this rustic setting, slammed against the old wooden door. It splintered on the first impact and flew open on the second, revealing an abyss of darkness and squalor within. The team, flashlights cutting through the gloom, moved inside, their faces grim. The air was unbreathable, thick with the stench of ammonia, mold, and something else, something sickeningly sweet. The interior of the cabin was a chaotic maze of refuse and hoarded junk, piled waist-high in some places. It was impossible to see the floor. As the officers and the social worker navigated the treacherous terrain, a figure erupted from the shadows. It was Jedediah Whitaker, his eyes blazing with feral rage. He was gaunt but surprisingly strong, screaming a torrent of what sounded like biblical condemnations. "Defilers, you will not have them. They are the Lord's pure flock." It took both state troopers to subdue and handcuff him as he thrashed and spat, his voice echoing through the dilapidated structure. It was then that Maria Flores saw them. Huddled in a far corner, behind a mound of rotting blankets and old newspapers, were 2 small figures. They were motionless, their backs to the commotion. As she slowly approached, speaking in a calm, gentle voice, one of them turned its head. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw it clearly, a crude, tightly fitted leather mask, its empty eyeholes staring into nothingness. There were 2 of them, 2 masked children, silent and still amidst the chaos of their world being torn apart. Jedediah Whitaker's arraignment was a somber affair, a clash of 2 worlds under the fluorescent chaos of a courtroom. It was a sterile, controlled environment where Jedediah, now an inmate in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, seemed diminished, a relic stripped of his kingdom of squalor. He sat stone-faced at the defendant's table, his lawyer, a weary public defender named Markham, shuffling through papers. The prosecutor laid out the charges from Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Jedediah Whitaker. 2 counts of incest, a Class C felony. 2 counts of criminal abuse first degree, also a Class C felony, and 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Each charge was a legal term for a lifetime of horror. Jedediah remained impassive, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience, a temporary interruption to his sacred duty. He refused to speak, to acknowledge the authority of the court he so clearly despised, a silence that was more damning than any confession. While the legal battle began, the true story was being pieced together 60 miles away, at the University of Kentucky Medical Center in Lexington. Caleb and Alara were placed in a specialized pediatric unit, a world of clean sheets, quiet nurses, and soft-spoken therapists that was as alien to them as another planet. They were catatonic, unresponsive to the brightly colored toys or gentle questions. Their entire existence had been confined to the dark, fetid cabin and the absolute authority of their grandfather. Maria Flores, the CHFS social worker, remained by their side, documenting their condition in case file B7-3491. The preliminary physical exams revealed severe malnutrition, rickets from a profound vitamin D deficiency, and atrophied muscles. But the most significant barrier remained in place: the crude leather masks. They refused to let anyone touch them, flinching violently at any attempt. The masks were not just a covering, they were a part of them, a second skin fused to their identity by years of terrifying indoctrination. The complexity of the case prompted the hospital to call in a specialist. Dr. Evelyn Reed was a pediatric geneticist, one of the nation's leading experts on congenital disorders, particularly those found in isolated communities. With her calm demeanor and sharp, analytical eyes, she was the voice of science entering a narrative steeped in folklore and fear. She reviewed the CHFS file and Deputy Carter's initial report, her expression hardening with a grim understanding. The details, the extreme isolation in a specific Appalachian pocket, the multi-generational seclusion, the desperate attempt to hide the children's faces, all pointed toward a hypothesis she had encountered before in textbooks and historical case studies. She knew the physical removal of the children was only the first step. To truly understand, and to have any hope of helping them, she had to see what Jedediah had fought so violently to conceal. The truth, she suspected, was written not in a holy book, but in their very DNA. The moment of revelation came not with force, but with patience. In a quiet, private examination room, with Maria Flores providing a comforting presence, Dr. Reed spent an hour simply sitting with the children, speaking in a low, soothing monotone. She showed Caleb a small, smooth stone, placing it in his hand. As the boy's attention was fixed on the object, she slowly, deliberately, reached for the leather tie at the back of his head. He tensed but didn't pull away. The mask came off. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. The nurses and even Maria Flores, who had seen the worst of child abuse, drew a sharp, collective breath. Caleb Whitaker suffered from a severe bilateral cleft lip and palate, his features further distorted by a pronounced jaw deformity. A few minutes later, Alara, seeing her brother was unharmed, allowed Dr. Reed to remove her mask as well. Her face showed the classic signs of a craniofacial dysostosis, with widely spaced eyes, a flattened nasal bridge, and a misshapen skull. It was a gallery of genetic tragedy. Dr. Reed's voice was steady as she presented her initial findings to Sheriff Brody and a stunned team of investigators. "What you are looking at," she explained, pointing to the clinical photographs, "are textbook examples of congenital anomalies associated with autosomal recessive inheritance. Think of it like a lottery ticket. Most of us carry a few bad genetic tickets, but they don't matter because they are cancelled out by a good ticket from our other parent. But in a closed breeding pool, the chances of two people carrying the same rare, bad ticket getting together increases exponentially. After a few generations, it becomes a near certainty." She drew a direct parallel to the famous Fugate family of Kentucky, whose members had blue skin due to a similar recessive gene. The masks, she concluded, were not an act of random cruelty. They were a crude, desperate attempt to hide the undeniable, visible proof of generations of incest. This scientific certainty was the key that unlocked the entire motive, shifting the case from one of neglect to a ritualized, long-running crime. The Whitaker cabin, now cordoned off with yellow tape, was a declared biohazard site. Yet, amidst the painstaking work of a forensics team in hazmat suits, Deputy Ben Carter found himself drawn back, unable to shake the feeling that the answer wasn't just in the children's DNA, but in the filth itself. He moved through the main room, now illuminated by portable floodlights that cast long, dancing shadows, the air still thick with an odor that clung to the back of the throat. He focused on a corner piled high with what looked like Jedediah's personal effects: stacks of yellowed almanacs, rusted tools, and moth-eaten wool blankets. Buried at the bottom of a rotted wooden crate, his gloved hand brushed against something solid and leather-bound. He carefully excavated it. It was a large, ancient-looking family Bible, its cover warped by damp and its spine held together by a piece of twine. It felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if it contained more than just scripture. Back at the sheriff's office, the Bible lay on Brody's desk like a cursed artifact. Its pages were brittle, flaking at the slightest touch. As Carter carefully turned them, he saw that it wasn't just a book of faith, it was a ledger of damnation. Tucked between the chapters of Leviticus were several sheets of lined paper, filled with spidery, archaic handwriting. It was a family tree, but one that twisted back on itself with sickening frequency. The entries, dating back to the late 1800s, meticulously documented unions between first cousins, uncles and nieces, and other close relatives. The final pages, in Jedediah's own shaky script, referred to it as the Covenant of the Unblemished, a sacred pact to keep their bloodline unspoiled by the world, and to bear the marks of our devotion. The incest wasn't a shameful secret, it was a foundational principle, a documented, multi-generational ritual passed down as a holy tradition. This discovery transformed the entire investigation. The Covenant was the Rosetta Stone for the Whitaker family's horror. It provided the missing why with chilling clarity. In a conference call with Dr. Reed and the Commonwealth's attorney, Sheriff Brody read excerpts from the document. The pieces snapped into place. The masks weren't just to hide deformity. They were a part of the ritual, a way to contain the physical manifestation of their so-called purity. Dr. Reed confirmed the documented lineage was a perfect genetic roadmap for the specific recessive disorders she had identified in Caleb and Alara. The case against Jedediah Whitaker was no longer about a single man's crimes of neglect and abuse. It was now about prosecuting the end product of a century-long conspiracy, a systematic tradition of abuse codified in a holy book. The family's own history had become the most powerful witness against its final patriarch. The story of the Whitaker family could not be contained within the quiet confines of Breathitt County. It leaked, as secrets of this magnitude always do, starting as a whisper in the courthouse hallways before erupting into a full-blown media firestorm. Within days, the narrow, winding road to Troublesome Creek was choked with satellite trucks from national news networks, their logos a jarring splash of corporate color against the muted Appalachian autumn. The case became a sensation, branded with lurid headlines that splashed across screens nationwide. House of Horrors in the Hills, Kentucky's Cursed Clan, the Masked Children of Appalachia. Reporters, parachuted in from New York and Atlanta, swarmed the town of Jackson, thrusting microphones into the faces of locals at the gas station and the Piggly Wiggly, hungry for any soundbite that fit their pre-written narrative of isolated, backward mountain folk. The world was now watching, its gaze a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, turning a complex local tragedy into a national spectacle. This sudden, intense scrutiny fractured the local community. In the booths of the Dairy Queen, the town's de facto social hub, conversations were hushed and tense. There was a deep, collective shame, a gnawing guilt that a horror of this scale could fester for so long, completely unseen. How had no one noticed? How could they have let those children suffer? But alongside the shame, a fierce defensiveness began to smolder. Many residents, whose families had lived in these hills for generations, resented the condescending tone of the outside media. They saw the cameras and the slick reporters not as truth seekers, but as cultural vultures, there to pick apart their way of life and confirm the ugliest stereotypes about Appalachia. The Whitaker case became a proxy war, pitting neighbor against neighbor and the entire community against a world that they felt had never understood them and was now eager to judge them. The pressure radiated outward, reaching the highest levels of state government in Frankfurt. The office of the governor was forced to issue a statement expressing deep concern and promising a full investigation into potential systemic failures. The Cabinet for Health and Family Services, already underfunded and overstretched, found itself at the center of a public relations nightmare, facing pointed questions about why the Whitaker family had remained off their radar for so long. The case became a political lightning rod, with child welfare advocates using the national spotlight to demand legislative action and increased funding for social services in Kentucky's poorest counties. The Commonwealth's attorney for the district, a career prosecutor named David Chenault, knew that the trial of Jedediah Whitaker would be the most scrutinized case of his life. The world wasn't just demanding a conviction, it was demanding an explanation for how this could have happened in modern America. In a desperate pre-trial maneuver, Jedediah's public defender filed a motion to have the family Bible and its handwritten covenant suppressed, arguing it was a private religious document protected under the First Amendment. The judge swiftly denied the motion, and in doing so, the contents of the Bible became part of the public record, accessible to anyone. News outlets immediately published excerpts of the twisted family tree and the chilling, self-justifying passages about keeping the bloodline unblemished. The family's most sacred and guarded secret, the very doctrine that had fueled a century of abuse, was now laid bare for the world to dissect and condemn. Jedediah's sacred covenant was now exhibited in a case that had horrified the nation. If you've been following the dark path that led to this moment, write in the comments, the covenant must be broken. The stage was now set for a trial that would put not just one man, but generations of secrets, on public display. The Breathitt County Circuit Court was packed, a standing room-only theater for the final act of a local tragedy that had become a national obsession. Jedediah Whitaker, clad in an ill-fitting suit provided by the public defender's office, looked smaller than he had in the woods, a withered tree uprooted and placed under the harsh, sterile lights of justice. He sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench, ignoring the gallery of whispering journalists and resentful townsfolk. The jury, a panel of 9 women and 3 men from the county, watched him with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The air was thick with anticipation as Commonwealth's attorney David Chenault rose to his feet. He was a methodical, unflashy prosecutor who knew this case wasn't about legal theatrics. The facts themselves were a scream. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm and even, "this is not a case about religious freedom. It is not about a simple, isolated way of life. It is about a prison. A prison built not of stone and steel, but of flesh and blood, of fear and dogma, where 2 children were held captive by a legacy they never chose." The prosecution's case unfolded with brutal efficiency, culminating in the moment the entire room had been dreading. Chenault projected an image onto a large screen facing the jury. It was a clinical, pre-op photograph of Caleb Whitaker, his mask removed. A collective, audible gasp filled the courtroom, followed by a dead, horrified silence. The image was stark, devoid of emotion, yet it screamed of generations of pain. The severe bilateral cleft, the misshapen jaw, it was the physical manifestation of the family's covenant. Chenault then displayed a photo of Alara, her craniofacial dysostosis just as pronounced. Jurors flinched. One woman brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Jedediah's lawyer, Markham, tried to counter, arguing his client was a victim himself, a man acting out of a twisted, protective love, trying to shield the children from the very judgment they were now receiving. He did not create the circumstances of his birth, Markham pleaded, he only did what he was taught was right, what he thought was merciful. But the argument felt hollow, a whisper against the deafening visual roar of the children's suffering displayed for all to see. It was during Markham's closing remarks that Jedediah's composure finally shattered. As his lawyer spoke of mercy, Jedediah scraped his chair back and rose to his feet, his knuckles white on the defense table. "Mercy?" he bellowed, his voice a raw, powerful roar that stunned the court into silence. He turned, not to the judge or the jury, but to the gallery, his eyes wild with a prophet's fire. "You speak of mercy? You, who dragged them into your world of freaks and gawkers? You, who put their faces on your glowing boxes for all to point and whisper at? I protected them, I kept them pure, I kept them from you." He jabbed a trembling finger toward the prosecutor's table. "You are the defilers, you are the cruel ones. You have ripped them from the only sanctuary they have ever known and thrown them to the wolves. May your God have mercy on your souls for what you have done." The outburst, a torrent of unrepentant fury and chilling self-righteousness, hung in the air, a confession more damning than any piece of evidence. The gavel fell, but it was too late. Jedediah Whitaker had just condemned himself with his own twisted gospel. The jury's deliberation was one of the shortest in Breathitt County history. They returned in under an hour, their faces set like stone. The foreman, a local hardware store owner, did not look at Jedediah as he read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Incest, criminal abuse, unlawful imprisonment. Jedediah Whitaker remained impassive, his outburst in court seemingly having purged him of all emotion. He stared straight ahead as the judge sentenced him to the maximum allowable term, 20 years in a state penitentiary, a sentence that, at 72 years of age, was a death sentence. He was led from the courtroom in shackles, a silent, unrepentant patriarch whose perverse kingdom had been reduced to an 8-by-10-foot cell. The law of the Commonwealth had finally pierced the veil of Troublesome Creek, and the covenant of the unblemished had ended not with a divine judgment, but with the cold, hard finality of a prison door slamming shut. The fate of Caleb and Alara became a matter of intense state and public interest. Placed in a specialized therapeutic foster home in a quiet Lexington suburb, they began a slow, agonizing journey out of the darkness. Their new world was one of routine, of clean sheets, of therapists who taught them words for feelings they never knew they had, and of doctors who began the long process of planning the multiple, complex surgeries needed to reconstruct their faces. For months, they would not look in mirrors. The removal of the masks had been a liberation, but it had also stolen the only identity they had ever known. Their progress was measured in inches. Alara speaking her first full sentence to a caregiver. Caleb picking up a crayon and drawing a picture of a son, something he had only ever seen in slivers through a grimy window. Their case became a flashpoint in Kentucky, forcing a painful statewide conversation about the forgotten children of Appalachia and the systemic failures that allow such horrors to fester in the shadows. The Whitaker cabin was eventually condemned and demolished by the state, its foul secrets bulldozed and buried under fresh soil. But the story remains, a permanent scar on the memory of the county. For Deputy Ben Carter, it was a career-defining case that left him with a deeper understanding of the darkness that can hide in the quietest corners of his jurisdiction. The legacy of Jedediah Whitaker was not the pure bloodline he so fanatically guarded, but a cautionary tale of how isolation, dogma, and fear can conspire to create a hell on earth. The true legacy now belongs to Caleb and Alara, two children slowly, painstakingly learning to live in a world that is no longer a thing to be feared, their future an uncertain but open page, free from the suffocating weight of a cursed covenant. The Whitaker case is a chilling reminder of the secrets that can lie hidden just off the beaten path. If you believe in the power of bringing these stories to light, subscribe to our channel for more investigations that matter. And be sure to watch our next video, where we explore the shocking case of the Turpin family, a story that proves this kind of darkness can hide anywhere, even in a quiet suburban neighborhood.